Hello and welcome to the 24th episode of Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Benjamin Parkins.
Okay, where to begin? Well, Wexit is still in the news. Western exit, the questions of Western separatism. We discussed it earlier in the week. What we didn't discuss, however, was the response of First Nations in Alberta. And there was a particularly impassioned speech given by Chief Troy Knowlton of one of the First Nations. And he does his best in this speech to explain this considerable history. I mean, going back, of course, to the initial contact and treaties and the basis of Canadian Confederation, but more specifically, he looks at the last 100 years. And where Alberta resources are concerned, there are lots of First Nations.
Sure.
And the consultation process, even the concept of a consultation process, is fairly recent. And at many times when decisions were made about getting the legal documents drafted in order to have First Nations give access to these resources over to the Alberta province, the fact is that Indigenous people simply didn't have the necessary or justified legal representation. And he takes great issue with this. He says, look, it's only in the last 50 years, okay, since really, Trudeau Senior's white papers and the threat and danger of those papers, which were papers that suggested that Indigenous people should simply become fully fledged Canadian citizens and give up any attachment to their independent First Nation sovereignty. He says, look, it's only in the last 50 years that we have had the beginnings of a proper robust control over resources with legal representation on the basis of a properly recognized sovereignty. And it gets to the heart of the problem here, and I'll actually quote the leader of the Bloc Québécois, Blanchet, who was asked whether he had any advice for the Albertans in their attempt to possibly separate. And he said, I can't tell them what they should do, but I can maybe say what they shouldn't do. And he went on to say, he said, you have to have a culture in order to have a nation. And he said very bluntly, I'm not sure that oil and gas is a culture. And maybe that sounds very insulting to the Albertans and dismissive of what they're trying to accomplish here. But we know that this is an attempt to accomplish some form of economic independence. What's sad is that this economic independence is coming at the expense, once again, of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And there are many skeptics of our relationships as a Canadian confederation with Indigenous peoples. Or should we be shelling out tens of billions of dollars? Should we be engaging with them at all? We have no responsibility. I think this is sometimes the unconscious attitude of many Canadians. But here's the point. One should contrast greatly an oil and gas culture with a culture that respects First Nations in Alberta, who are not interested in simply giving up all of their ties to the federal government, the support, funding, and otherwise that comes with that, in order to come under the possible protection of a provincial government, should it become a nation, that will not necessarily be very interested in maintaining treaties, respecting sovereignty, since it's going down the intensification of this oil and gas route.
Right. Well, that's sort of the thing, is that you're trading what is part of First Nations culture now, which is this relationship with the government. I mean, like you said, in the past, it's only the past 50 years that they've even really had much legal standing. It's only even more recently that we've started to accept treaties, things like oral histories, certain traditions, certain cultural traditions. And so that's how they've sort of had to negotiate their own culture in the modern world, is not by just totally submitting, is by, in fact, in many cases, really making the Canadian government submit to them to say, this is what we have. We have storytellers, we have oral histories, we have people who do not fulfill roles that necessarily exist in North American, European, traditional legal society, and that Canada has to adapt to this. And so, yeah, I think that there's a subset of Canadians that would look at that and say, wow, they've preserved their culture by feeding off of tax dollars and by depending on the welfare state in this way that's not entrepreneurial or building on their culture is really just they want to do their own thing and they want to do their own thing off of our backs. But it's such a mistake to not understand that, they've had to negotiate a new reality, but they've really preserved their culture and their sort of social way of being first and foremost, and not their economic way, right? I mean, we all know that they're underfunded. But some of that underfundedness comes from the fact that they, took a bad deal to be able to preserve some elements of their culture and of their social well-being. It's unfortunate that Canada, that doesn't fund them, doesn't have, we all know this, right? There are places with no clean drinking water, inadequate housing, things like that. Um, but there's a certain resilience in these people being able to preserve their way of life in this way, and they do have a real way of life. Um, that's sort of divorced from this economic reality. Whereas I think what Blanchette is maybe speaking to is the fact that Albertans, and we've talked about this in a number of ways, don't necessarily have that. I mean, their concept of culture and the concept of freedom and concept of personal responsibility in Canada is so tied to something like uh, where you work, in what industry you work, what taxes you pay, what you do with your free time, which is, oftentimes driving to somewhere to pay too much for something. Um, and so I can understand Albertans, kind of feeling abandoned in this way. If there's no new plan, right? If there's no way for their way of life moving forward, but it does require a look at what your way of life is, what your social order is. Um, because I don't think that even if there is a green transition and one for one, everyone who works in the oil sands gets a job working on a wind farm, if the wind farm still powers um, cities that have houses you can't afford, where you have to drive everywhere, that feel unsafe, that don't serve anyone's social reality, then we're still getting a raw deal basically. And I think it'll require a lot of investigation on Albertans' part to say, honestly, first, what do we want? And secondly, how do we get it? I mean, right now, it seems like they're basically just saying, well, right now, this is how we get things, and we want to keep getting things our way. Now, what those things actually are doesn't really seem like very many people want to talk about. Um, and that to me is almost the first discussion. That should happen first. And then the economic reality can be determined based on what people want. But right now, we're just holding on to an economic reality of, well, oil and gas is Alberta, and that's what we want. And if you're going to take it away, then we're going to go somewhere else. Um, I don't understand why you wouldn't talk about, well, we want affordable housing, we want good childcare, we want universal health care that works for people, that doesn't have crazy wait times. Now, how do we get that through an economic model? Right now, it just seems like they're holding on to the economic model. For what reason, I'm not totally certain.
But they imagine that they'll get very wealthy. They imagine that they'll address their affordable housing issues. The truth is, I don't think that the Albertans are going to get a very good deal.
Mhm.
We discussed it earlier this week. There's a kind of boom and bust cycle around resource dependent economies.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the thing, is that oftentimes it's almost thought of that, oh, Alberta, it's like Alberta makes, Canada takes, right? Is that they actually could have all of this money that they can reinvest into their economy, and then they would become this totally wealthy state where they can achieve all these things. But we basically know that that's not true because they're totally at the whims of the market.
Which is what makes Albertans at the present moment much more in the same boat as the First Nations in
Mhm.
Alberta than they might like to imagine. You mentioned earlier lack of I mean, basic failure in housing, for not just in affordability,
Mhm.
but failure in housing. We discussed last week a class action lawsuit brought against the Canadian government, stretching back to the late 90s, accusing the government not simply of failing to provide housing, but deliberately failing to provide housing. Now, again, people might look and ask themselves, why is the Canadian government not providing housing and doing so deliberately? Well, the Canadian government doesn't exist to provide affordable housing, doesn't exist to provide housing or clean drinking water or even necessarily basic civil liberties. It exists as an appendage of global markets. I regret to say that many of our fictions and political personalities are based on a little bit of a lie, which is that the Canadian government is here simply to serve the welfare of Canadians. And what you see with Albertans in the province or First Nations peoples in the province of Alberta is a common struggle against the fact that present political institutions do not exist to provide the basics for living. It's worth mentioning, Indigenous peoples have not just insisted and stood up for their right in negotiations with the Canadian government. They have actively adapted to Western models of law. There are Indigenous lawyers. There are Indigenous judges. There are Indigenous entrepreneurs. This is something that is also readily ignored. Um, and even though I think you're entirely right that there's this bigger question of adaptation, and there's been a remarkable process of adaptation and a remarkable defense of a non-Western lifestyle and non-economic way of organizing, yes, resources, society, even democratic liberties. So with the fantasy of the oil sands as not just a culture but as a political society. I mean, at the moment, really, there's a oil and gas, and then there's Alberta as a culture. There's not Alberta and then the oil sands, unfortunately. And the fantasy of getting that level of political autonomy is what we'll be able to address finally without the federal government stealing from us, right? Um, our our economic bereavement. But they're never going to say, but maybe it's the economics that we've been indulging that have resulted in this fundamental lack of control,
Mm.
right? To that end, another story in the news out of Ontario is Ford is looking to install what he calls special economic zones, which is literally a phrase the Chinese Communist Party used um, towards the end of the 20th century when they wanted to integrate the entire Chinese coastline, turning it into the giant manufacturing and development hub that we've come to know it.
Right. So if you thought that Farage talking about nationalizing British steel was crazy, now we have Doug Ford is a Maoist.
Doug Ford is a Maoist.
Yeah.
Now, how should we evaluate this? I actually think we shouldn't be skeptical because the fact that conservatives are realizing that politics is so gridlocked that unless they take extraordinary liberties, and let's be clear here, this is an extraordinary liberty. What it means is slashing any environmental regulation, any regulation pretty much of any kind, any consultation with Indigenous peoples, policies in short, regulations in short, that many people refer to as red tape, which they consider to be bureaucratic, which they consider to be woke in short. Here's the thing though, most conservatives have no idea how to overcome red tape. No idea. What they have is let's provide the private sector with more initiative, more incentives. Ford doesn't think like this. This is the big distinction between someone like Doug Ford and someone like Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the federal conservatives. It's this difference in where we need to completely get rid of this political gridlock, find an intense system of political engagement. Doug Ford has also looked and questioned what's called judicial independence. He has argued for installing elected judges like they do in the United States, which I think would be a terrible idea. Elon Musk was recently caught in a scandal to the tune of $20 million of his own money, which he put behind a judicial race in Wisconsin. So this is not apolitical once you go to elected judges. But what I will give Ford credit, I give him credit for the fact that judicial independence is not apolitical. It works if you have a very strong political identity. Right now, Canada doesn't have a very strong political identity. And even if I don't like the slashing of every kind of regulation, I can understand the political mentality. It's just like Ford's old phrase of Canada's not for sale.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes we need some of these conservative slogans, which might not be right entirely in content, but are right in form, because they emphasize a radical political departure from the standard gridlocked way of doing things.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that's the thing is that it's interesting. It's like we don't have a great identity right now, but there's actually like it's like we talked about, and people hate kind of the horseshoe theory, but we talked about this last time, which is that oftentimes you can go so far right that you become left, which is that basically everyone is admitting that development, quality of life, all of these measures of a successful society are stagnant, if not outright declining, basically. I mean, this is what Polyev and Carney are both operating on the same basis. They've admitted it. We at least don't have some delusional world in which we have liberals that are telling us that everything is okay. They're at least admitting to this. But yeah, it's interesting to see um, this kind of admission of reality playing out from these two different ways, which is to say that, you know, the government is capable of these incredible things. Now, obviously, I'm not in favor of removing any environmental protections or consulting with Indigenous peoples. But what I am in favor of is someone admitting, "Wow, we are just totally not where we should be economically, productively, socially, in any way, basically, that quality of life in what is supposed to be one of the countries of the world that has the highest quality of life is just totally not what anyone is after. And that, you know, as we saw in the pandemic, the government actually has an incredible power to do things, to sort of shut everything down, reopen everything, force businesses to really act. Now, obviously, that's a use of an emergency situation. But at what point do we start saying that this is an emergency? This is an emergency, in fact, in some ways, worse than the pandemic, which is that we are living in a world where everyone is sick all of the time, 24/7, and no one is basically addressing what's actually causing the sickness. That's the only thing that I see lacking from Ford or Carney really in general is you know, they'll make these radical departures. He'll do this thing, right? We're creating these zones, or Carney will talk about building, you know, all these houses. Um, it's rare that you'll see someone say, "Why do we have to do this? Why have the markets not provided adequate housing? Why is housing so expensive? Why is it so hard to start a business in Canada? Why is there so much red tape that for some people that can even be debated? Well, is it worth consulting with Indigenous peoples or is it not? Or do we do too much of it? Is it too woke? You know, we're not seeing a ton of people address it. Why there's such an issue with productivity and upward social mobility. So, you know, as radical as it is, oftentimes what I think the dimension that's really missing that would be really radical is someone actually asking, why have forces conspired to put us in this situation? And how do we sort of remove ourselves from this global context that puts us in such a precarious situation?
And I think one of the fundamental fears is that government is in fact very powerful.
Mm,
And there are people on the right who are very afraid of that power and want to constrain that power or deny the logical and economic feasibility or conditions of that power. There are people at the same time who are more left leaning, but in many ways are centrists, who are the technocrats of this system. You know, what the right like to call the Davos um, educated technocrats who are very interested in maintaining an intensive form of monetary economics and monetary global economics. And in a sense, they both, one doesn't want you to realize how powerful the government is, the technocrats. The other wants to repress the power of that government. So what's interesting is to see one option on the right that is deviating from the traditional right, saying, well, no, they are very powerful.
mhm.
One has to be very, very careful here, of course. I like to call them the leftist without leftists.
Right.
This is Farage to an extent Trump. We have seen it in the 20th century before. I won't, people will know who I'm talking about, the leftists without leftism in the 20th century. Well, traditionally they're the fascists. That's the truth. But hopefully then there's another alternative on the left
Mhm.
for people who, again, are interested in, can at least admit to themselves the power of government, are not seeking to conceal the power of government like the technocrats, and are maybe trying to investigate whether it's nationalization, whether it's special economic zones. Now that the right are able to do it, and they do it flagrantly,
Mhm.
they don't go and consult,
Mhm.
ironically, anyone about whether or not they're going to mobilize intensive political tools in order to call a crisis a crisis. But it does really come down to what the crisis is
Mhm.
intensely. I mean, what we think that, how we got into this situation, but more importantly, how we're going to get out of it. What is the fundamental problem? Is it
Mhm.
simply, you know, too many people and therefore increased rents, lack of supply? Is it a market problem at all? Is it the problem of markets, right? As opposed to a market problem, what's the problem of markets? Which means it's a problem of the same economics that we're going to see should Alberta go down this road, the same economics that Indigenous communities and First Nations have been subjected to. The incapacity of our own government to provide housing means that when there are certain situations in which the social need is extreme, but the economics are not there, the government can't show up.
Mhm.
Right, which is the place where the government is tremendously impotent, which will tell you a lot about the kind of government we have at the moment.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's interesting. Like we're sort of contrasting that. We were just mentioning that the Canadian government is kind of an appendage of global markets, and yet actually does have some incredible power. Um, that's what's really interesting here, and that's what I think needs to be kind of negotiated. Is that you know why and how is the government able to in many cases sort of step up and to some people overstep in ways that feel so counterproductive, and yet be so tepid in ways that seem to really matter. I mean, how is it possible that a government um can shut down a country for a year, and yet not provide adequate housing or not counterbalance market forces?
And when pandemic happened, the reason why the governments of the world said we need to shut everything down is because the economy collapsed.
Mhm.
That was the emergency. Now we can say, oh, but the emergency was clearly indexed to public health. This big issue of public health, the pandemic, resulted in the economic dysfunction. I think that, unfortunately, the public health crisis could have gone on as long as anyone would have wanted if the economy had remained healthy. If the economy had not been affected.
Right.
Now, of course, it takes a rare kind of event to upset the global economy at that level. But let's remember something with the global economy, it relies upon expectation. That does not make it a fair taskmaster.
Mm.
Its interest in the health of the human being is not a humanitarian interest, is not a public health informed interest. It's an interest in the extent to which it can continue selling the story that the economy is healthy, right? This is a vital principle in modern economics, no matter where you're looking. When you produce a report in economics, when you tweet something about your company, when the central bank chooses to lower interest rates or increase interest rates, the anticipation, the expectation, and the eventual statement itself overdetermines the economic result.
Mm.
Therefore, anyone who participates in the global economy in a financial position, in a governmental position, has to take into consideration the fact that they can affect the weather, so to speak, to paraphrase Yanis Varoufakis. This is something that is vital to the fiction selling, the storytelling of the economy. So when the story is very, very bad, when nobody can say that the economy is sort of working, then it is forced into a position of collapse. And that collapse is interesting. You would think that if there was something more than storytelling, more than just endless forms of credit chains, chains of debt,
Mm.
giant transactional chains, that the economy might have some resiliency, some robustness beyond, say, okay, supply chains going AWOL. But I think this is the lesson of the pandemic. It wasn't just that we're so integrated so that someone gets sick that we can't function. The truth is, we don't have any independent economic resiliency. So once the global structure of capital breaks down, once the movement of financial transactions breaks down, once we can no longer competently continue selling the story that at the end of this financial transaction is a really existing company or a really existing housing market, everything breaks down, which is what happened during the pandemic.
Hmm. Yeah, which I think takes us to the ongoing war in the U.S. government, not the trade war with Canada, but basically Trump versus the Fed. So white smoke has billowed out of the Fed building, and there's some news on interest rates, which it seems like Trump is not particularly happy with.
Well, the Fed is not going to lower interest rates, and Trump wants them to lower interest rates.
Yeah.
And this gets into the heart of the point I just made about expectation. Because when when you lower interest rates, what it means is that you're not afraid of inflation. Your target inflation is sort of either stable or even lower than expected, which means that you can cheapen the cost of money, more people can borrow, more money in the economy. So you've got to believe that there's some form of resiliency, productivity, growth, employment in the economy.
Right.
If you're going to lower interest rates, you've got to believe that there are genuine opportunities for people who are going to borrow to do something with the money that they have. If
Yeah.
you believe that the economy in some ways or another, if there's too much money already, i.e., inflation, you're not going to lower interest rates. Trump wants people to be borrowing money, wants people to be spending money, and therefore he clearly seems to have a very different view of the economy from the Federal Reserve. This is an intentionally political discussion because this is not a surprise, but the Trump economy very much exists in Trump's head only.
Mm.
That doesn't mean he is wrong, but it means that if the Federal Reserve says, no, we think that inflation is going to increase, we don't believe the logic behind tariffs, we don't believe that you're going to get any of this reindustrialization, we don't believe you're going to convince anyone to bring back car manufacturing to the United States or start making phones for the first time in the United States. If the Federal Reserve, which of course they'll take a very conservative view of the numbers, that's their job. They are supposed to be apolitical, and they're again about as apolitical as Canada's judicial system. They're very, very political, but they agree to engage in a neutral way with respect to the fundamental political axioms of society. So when those axioms are being questioned, like by Trump, when he's saying, I don't want globalization, I want economic resiliency, I want less dependence on the financial sector. I want people to be really building here, really manufacturing here. Um, it obviously produces a counter narrative to the setup of the American economy itself. So this is a frustration, and it's so illustrative of how it's the same reason why Ford felt the need to come up with these special economic zones. He shouldn't have to go to the point where he says, I don't care about the environment. There shouldn't have to be this contradiction between the environment and politics. On the contrary, we should be building our not our economy, our society off of an interest in the environment, off of an interest of Indigenous peoples, but also off of an interest of some form of social resiliency, which globalization does not give us. So, if you get into this kind of conflict, what do you do? I mean, people have long debated whether or not Trump can or will attack the Federal Reserve. He doesn't have the power to do so, to choose a new chairman. But you can see that this is where we get the specter of the China model reappears, right? Again, Ford borrowed this phrase, special economic zones, from the Chinese, whether he realizes it or not, or independent of the other uses that phrase has been put to. And it's the same thing with Trump. He might be pushed into a corner where he needs a very different kind of politics than the setup of American society, of American legal society, and American economic society can give him.
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of this also is that, the fact that Trump is a businessman, and I think that he sees America as being a nation of businessmen and women who are able to build real things, become wealthy, fulfill the American dream. I think he's someone who believes in that. As such, interestingly enough, his family's money is no longer being made in the real economy, though there's some speculation it never was. I mean, famously, sort of took a loss on every real estate deal, has these billions of dollars. How real are they? Could he make them real? His family is making a lot of money on crypto. I mean, there was Trump coin, there was Melania coin, and there's more now going on.
Well, Trump basically is using his cryptocurrency to now sell access to him. So he'll say, if you have a certain amount of coins, you can come to the special presidential dinner.
Right.
But that's not even the weirdest part. What's weird is actually the economics behind how they make money. Now, cryptocurrencies are kind of interesting because there are more than one cryptocurrency. They have basically they have something called liquidity pools, which is basically, do they have enough cryptocurrency that you can actually exchange it for other cryptocurrencies, and the cost of those transactions can be charged. Now, this is something that a variety of economists have spoken about, which is the reemergence or the intensification of rent. This is charging rent on a financial transaction. This is very interesting. Much of the neoliberal period of global finance, neoliberalism, globalization has been built upon the opposite principle, the pure movement of capital. Unfettered, untouched, I can invest wherever I want, make money wherever I want. This is also why there are attacks on taxation, attacks on public service. Anything that gets in the way of the movement of that capital needs to be removed. So what's interesting is to see a financial technology that emerged after 2008 to provide resiliency, to provide a new kind of economic integrity, removal of the top-down structure in monetary economies where the central bank is making all of the big decisions, and it's interesting to see it being used to create a new system of rent extraction. So Trump, in short, doesn't care about who actually uses this cryptocurrency, unlike the cryptocurrency idealists who want to really see it used as a real currency and are putting into action
Mhm.
von Hayek's concept of money markets, where you genuinely have different kinds of money that are competing, and the best one will win the day or win the markets. Here you have an interest in providing a fiction of finance, a story of finance, where people can go and say, I'm engaging with genuine financial transactions. I'm selling this currency and shoring that other one, and thinking about the cryptocurrency market. And in the meanwhile, there's someone who is hosting, right, all of these transactions. And the Trump family has made somewhere in the range of $300 million. Trump himself is only worth about $3 billion. They're probably more now,
Mhm.
though his legal fees are enormous, as I understand, or
Mhm.
were, I mean, until he became president. But $300 million in a very short period of time. And it's indicative of maybe how the economy can go
Mhm.
if it wants to intensify its worst impulses. This is a version of the Trump economy where he's not creating manufacturing, where he's not building, where he's not thinking about um, um, sustainable ways to get that resiliency, that social
Right.
resiliency, but is looking towards not just forms of increased privatization of resources, increased privatization of money, of investment and capital, but creating a system in which he can host that and make a rent. This is an ugly story in so many ways, and something that we should look for whenever we see it, because it's going to appear more and more. It already appears in Amazon, in Apple, in Alphabet, and Meta. It is principally the economic model of the major tech companies, but it's probably bound to be the economic model, unfortunately, of the Trump economy. I don't see them really resurrecting manufacturing,
Mm.
even if any more than I see Doug Ford's special economic zones actually working to fix the 401 or develop the Ring of Fire, not least because the 401 and the Ring of Fire might not be the development projects we want to see developed.
Right.
They rely upon an enormous reinforcement, not just of global markets, but of what global markets want. What do they want? Everyone driving a car and critical minerals so that we all can have iPhones. We have to have a big discussion about not just the economy we want, but the society we want. And it's important to stay attentive to the insidious innovations